Why is it that in most relationships, the one who gets hurt the most is us? Is it because we don't know how to love? Because we love the wrong way? Or simply because the other person hurt us? If I asked you right now, who caused you that pain, I believe most answers would be someone else. If you've ever thought that way too, pause for 3 seconds and leave a comment below to let me know. I understand that feeling, because I've been exactly where you are. I used to blame others. I used to think, if they changed, I wouldn't be hurting like this. Until one day, I realized a truth that was very hard to accept. No one can hurt me unless I allow them to. I was the one who opened the door. I was the one who stayed silent. I was the one who stayed while my boundaries were being crossed again and again. And from that moment on, I began to learn how to set boundaries, clear limits for what I can accept and what I cannot. Anyone who crosses those boundaries, no matter who they are, I am willing to let them walk out of my life. Welcome to my channel. This is where I walk alongside women on the journey of building a self-directed life. A life rooted in independence and inner happiness. And to begin that journey, I want to share with you 2 very familiar stories, because chances are you might see yourself in them. I once met a woman who was extremely kind, always listening, always accommodating, always telling herself, "It's okay, I can handle it." She believed that was self-love. She believed that silence meant maturity, until one day she became completely exhausted and couldn't understand why she felt so empty inside. Then I met another woman, someone who said no clearly, who knew what she wanted and what she would not accept. She was labeled as too high maintenance or acting like she's valuable, when in truth she wasn't trying to prove anything at all, because a person who truly has value doesn't need to prove it, doesn't need to perform, and certainly doesn't need to sacrifice themselves to be loved. Then I met another woman, someone who said no clearly, who knew what she wanted and what she would not accept. She was labeled as too high maintenance or acting like she's valuable, when in truth she wasn't trying to prove anything at all, because a person who truly has value doesn't need to prove it, doesn't need to perform, and certainly doesn't need to sacrifice themselves to be loved. Personal boundaries are not walls meant to push people away. They are lines that help you distinguish who you are and who you are not. When you set boundaries, you are not punishing others, you are protecting yourself from being taken advantage of, from invisible violations, and from subtle influences that slowly erode your mental health day after day. Boundaries and self-worth always go hand in hand. People with low self-worth often allow others to decide their value. People with healthy self-worth know exactly what they will accept and what they will walk away from, without argument. And you don't need to wait until you have high self-worth to start setting boundaries, because learning to establish firm boundaries is precisely how you build self-worth from the inside. At an even deeper level, boundaries are inseparable from personal identity. You cannot truly be yourself if you are still carrying emotions that are not yours, if you are still taking responsibility for other people's behavior, if you are still asking, is it my fault or theirs, when deep down you already know the answer. Questions like who should take responsibility, who is crossing the line, and why you are always the one enduring, these are not meant to blame, but to guide you back to yourself. And when you can answer them, you don't just have boundaries, you have identity, you have self-worth, and you begin to live as yourself, no longer the version who exists to please everyone else. What I want to emphasize here is this. Setting boundaries is not only important, it is something most of us have neglected for years, especially women. We are taught to be well-behaved, understanding, self-sacrificing, until enduring becomes so normalized that we no longer realize we've crossed our own limits. But the hardest boundaries to establish are not with partners or friends, they are with family. Because you can leave a relationship, but you can never truly disconnect from your parents. Most of us didn't lack knowledge, we lacked permission to have boundaries from a very young age. We grew up in families where obedience was considered love, sacrifice was considered virtue, and children's emotions were often dismissed with phrases like, "We do this for your own good." Over time, you learn to believe that having needs is selfish, that saying no is disrespectful, and that your worth lies in pleasing others. That is why family boundaries are the hardest, because you are not just confronting people, you are confronting beliefs that have followed you your entire life. And because you cannot cut ties with your parents, you learn to adapt instead of resist. You swallow your emotions, take responsibility for the family's emotional climate, for other people's satisfaction, and you call that maturity. But psychology doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It finds another way to surface. Very often, that way is through romantic relationships. You love the way you were taught to love in your family. You give more than you can bear. You stay longer than is safe. And you fear that if you set limits, you will be abandoned. It is not a coincidence that you repeatedly attract emotionally unavailable, controlling, or emotionally irresponsible partners, because deep down, your nervous system has mistaken that attachment pattern for love. However, there is something crucial many people don't realize. You don't have to start healing boundaries with your family. In fact, that is often the most painful and difficult place to begin. Romantic relationships, paradoxically, are a safer laboratory to practice boundaries, because there you have choice, you have agency, and you can observe your reactions when you say no. Each time you hold a boundary in a romantic relationship, you rewrite your internal reference system. That love is not the same as endurance, that healthy connection doesn't require self-erasure, and that you can be loved without disappearing. As these boundaries become stronger in relationships you are free to choose, you begin to notice subtle but profound changes. You no longer overreact to control. You feel less guilt for prioritizing yourself, and you are no longer terrified of losing a relationship. And at that point, even your boundaries with family, without needing to be spoken aloud, begin to shift from within. Not through rebellion, but through maturity. Not through cold distance, but through an inner strength that keeps you from losing yourself in any relationship again. Personal boundaries rarely disappear loudly. They fade quietly. And this fragility is usually shaped by two core forces: dependency and expectation. I have met many people who enter relationships not because they are fulfilled, but because they are lacking attention, lacking the feeling of being seen, chosen, and loved. In psychology, this state is called codependence, emotional dependency. When someone desperately needs love and validation from the outside, they are willing to trade away their identity, shrink, or erase their boundaries just to keep a relationship. Ironically, the moment you lose your identity and boundaries is also the moment you lose your attractiveness, because no one can truly bond with someone who is no longer themselves. In these relationships, many people tend to blame others for their own emotions and behavior. They believe that if they place that responsibility on the other person, "You made me sad, you caused this," they will be compensated for their inner emotional deprivation. At an even deeper level, they carry a naive belief: if they suffer enough, someone will eventually come and save them. On the other side are those who willingly accept that role, the rescuer. They constantly fix, solve, and sacrifice, believing that if they can change someone, they will finally receive the love, gratitude, and validation they crave. These two types of people naturally find each other because they carry matching expectations. And importantly, most of them did not create this pattern themselves. They inherited it from their families. They grew up in environments lacking healthy attention, where boundaries were blurred and love was tied to sacrifice, responsibility, or emotional debt. As a result, their internal model of a happy relationship is built on scarcity and dependency. Ironically, in this kind of relationship, both sides completely fail to meet each other's true emotional needs. The victim creates more and more problems, not because life is that bad, but because they need attention. The rescuer tirelessly solves problem after problem, not because they truly care about each issue, but because they fear that if they stop, they will no longer be loved. And the love and appreciation both long for never truly reach each other, because each is trying to fill their own emptiness through the other. In my book Patterns, I wrote that in relationships, anything given with a hidden motive, especially the expectation of being repaid, is no longer a true gift. When that happens, giving loses its connective value and becomes merely a tool to serve personal needs. This is exactly what happens in codependent relationships. The complainer doesn't complain because the problem is unbearable, but because they believe it will earn them more love. The helper doesn't help because they genuinely care, but because they believe solving the problem will buy affection. In both cases, expectation is the force that binds boundaries, fuels dependency, erodes self-worth, diminishes attraction, and ultimately leads to self-destruction on both sides. And in the next video, I will walk you through how healthy boundaries are formed, how they differ from unhealthy ones, and why some boundaries that look strong actually come from fear, while others that seem gentle can protect you far more powerfully than you imagine. If you're tired of always giving too much, feeling overwhelmed, or not knowing where to stop in your relationships, that video is for you. Subscribe to the channel, follow, and turn on notifications, because building boundaries is not about becoming cold or distant. It's about learning how to love, connect, and live as yourself in a healthier, more whole way.